and their stabilizing influence. Fatherless boys, as a general rule, become ineligible to be husbands, though no less likely to become fathers, and their children fall into the same patterns that render them ineligible to be husbands. The absence of fathers means as well that girls lack both a pattern against which to measure the boys who pursue them, and an example of sacrificial love between a man and a woman. In other words, these young girls don't know what to look for. So there is a crisis in the family, an economic crisis, a political crisis, and there is a crisis in the church. The challenges of the church today are many, and it's difficult to define which are the most ominous. As a pastor, I would say that its greatest malady usually boils down to two chronic ailments with which we pastors and church leaders continually strive to overcome. The first is compromise with standards of the world. Unfortunately, the modern American church seems to have been more influenced by society rather than society being affected by the church. A recent Gallup poll shows a majority of Americans profess to be Christians, but the general spiritual condition of our nation has never been worse. Look at your neighbor and say, never been worse. The fact is, although many churches have concentrated on techniques of getting people in the doors, they have not always been successful in improving their spiritual condition. Today, there's no emphasis on prayer. We do more feasting than we do fasting. We are more concerned about the saving of seats than the saving of souls. Then we wonder why thus saith the mind is substituted for thus saith the Lord. Then we wonder why we hear gospel bedtime stories and pulpit lullabies. The Apostle Paul said, beloved, in 2 Corinthians 7:1, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. There's a widespread deficiency in the basic elements of Christian character, ethics, and morality. We have rejected divine order. Just touch your neighbor and tell them we've rejected divine order. Divine order has reference to God, to God's ordained system of divine order. Divine order has reference to God's system of divine order, his management for the church. As the sovereign ruler of the universe, God has a plan of government for everything he created. One of his first acts of creation was the forming of light. He set government for the daylight hours by creating the sun to govern the day and the moon to govern the night. God sets order for everything by establishing someone or something to be in charge of other men or things just like it. In creation, archangels were set to govern other angels. In the autumn, a single goose majestically flies in front of other geese, leading them on an annual pilgrimage as they migrate from north to south in the winter and back again in the spring. In world affairs, kings are divinely chosen to sit in authority over other citizens. In like manner, God, who knows the needs of a congregation, has anointed a spiritual leader in the local church. And all spiritual gifts, ministries, and appointments to serve in various positions in the local body must be under the authority of the leader of the local house at all times, or they're out of order. We have allowed members of the church to have more influence over us than the pastor. Some witch in the pew, some warlock in the pew. And when they leave the church, you have the audacity to follow them. Note the moral dysfunction among professing Christians. Parallel that of secular society. We got domestic violence in the church, drug abuse in the church, alcoholism in the church, homosexuality leading our choirs and playing our musical instruments. And it's hard for me to understand how a man can fall in love with another man. It's hard for me to understand what's so attractive about some other man's rusty knees. My brothers and sisters, if we marry the world today, we'll be a widow tomorrow. The second thing about the church is its apathy towards its mission in the world. By and large, the modern church world has become mostly occupied with what God can do for them, rather than remembering their mission to reach the lost for Christ. We live in a very self-centered society, and rarely do we see churches and believers laying aside their selfish interests to serve the Lord's interests. But know this, in the last days, perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. The scripture makes it clear that it is the duty of every Christian to take on the task of helping to bring people to the saving message. But unfortunately, the statistics show that only a tiny percent of Christians ever attempt to share their faith with others. This apathy is inexcusable and has contributed to the woes of our society, which can only be remedied by the new birth of Christ in the hearts of sinful men and women. So we have an economic crisis. We have a political crisis. We have a family crisis. We have a church crisis. And I'm sure that after hearing what I just finished intimating to you, you want to know, well, Pastor, how can things for me as an individual become better? Because the family crisis, the economic crisis, the political crisis, the church crisis, they all affect me. Well, let's look at the text before us, and hopefully we can find some direction in how to get things to become better in our lives. In verse 1, we have an unnamed feast. Some scholars argue passionately that it's the feast of Passover, and some say it's the Feast of Tabernacles. So on that point, there is no agreement. However, there's one thing that we can agree on, that we see in the first verse, and that is that Jesus went to it. Now, if there was anyone who could justify himself or claim exemption in not attending a religious service,